Previously at Laura B. Studios.
For one thing, I am a sucker for a hero who's spurred to helping others because they went through a traumatic experience. I broke Ryuki's women up into 4 archetypes that continue to echo across Writer to this day like a scream at the Grand Canyon. Hi everyone, my name is Laura B, aka Twitter user at httyd, which you probably already know if you're watching this video. And if I was forced at gunpoint to name a concept in a franchise that I love, I would say, wow, that's an oddly specific request and probably not worth shooting me over, but I'd say categorizing storytelling devices and Kamen Rider. I love tropes. I love watching or reading something and then heading over to TV tropes to see how many of them I caught while I was doing it. I know the exact difference between Chekhov's gun, Chekhov's gunman, Chekhov's hobby, and Chekhov's skill. And of course, I love applying those things to Kamen Rider. But what I think is interesting about Kamen Rider is that, throughout the course of its history, it's kind of codified its own tropes and storytelling devices. These aren't exclusive to Rider, of course, but once you start picking up on the patterns in this way, you see them a lot. Being able to recognize a trope is a huge part of media literacy, because through them, you can understand why and how a story is being told, and when you filter that through Rider, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what a show is trying to say if you can pick up on the building blocks that make that message. So for my first long-form video for 2026, I decided to yap about some character archetypes that we see in our beloved Karate Bugman. Why characters, and why just writers? Well, for one thing, Kamen Rider is an action series. The characters who are most directly involved in said action are the ones who are going to get the most development, simply because they have the most to do. In addition, because Kamen Rider airs for a year straight, the way that these characters grow and change is the draw for a lot of people. Or, well, it is for me anyway. I think about them a lot, and that's why I figured I'd talk about them. So before we get into the writer tropes I've identified, let's get the usuals out of the way. First of all, this video will contain spoilers. Like a lot of them, probably. And because this video is going to be focusing on tropes I've noticed franchise-wide, that means we're going to have a lot of spoilers. If I'm going to talk about a show you haven't seen and you'd like to watch it blind, feel free to pause this video and do so before you click back. Secondly, these are in fact archetypes I've identified, but that doesn't mean you can't have your own opinions on them or that you can't disagree with me. As always, I humbly request that, even if you disagree, just be cool and normal and we'll have no problems here. And lastly, I know a lot of people watch Rider for escapism, and thinking about it in this way isn't going to be something a lot of people like doing. While I think it's absolutely worth it to look deeper into things, that isn't how a lot of people engage with Rider, and you know what? That's okay. I can't control the way you think, or your actions, or the way that you watch shows. If you want to start looking deeper though, keep watching. I'll even make it fun. So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about Kamen Rider archetypes and why they matter.
Wait, so what even is a character?
Now, I don't want to underestimate my dear audience's intelligence, but just in case, let's talk about what a character is, just so that we're all on the same page. My friends over at Wiktionary define a character as a being involved in the action of a story. The role of a character is twofold. They carry out the actions and decisions that move a story forward, and they provide us humans being told a story something to invest in to make us care about said story. If a story didn't have characters, or if a story doesn't have strong characters, it's a lot harder for the audience to care about what's happening. In a work that's character-driven, it's the actions of the characters that drive the plot. Revice, for example, has arcs that exist because the character did something, and the other characters have to deal with it. In a work that's more plot-driven, like Gaim, for example, the characters still drive the plot, but in a different way. An incident occurs thanks to the fact that it occurred, and the story comes from how the characters react to and because of said incident. Now, not every character is of equal importance. Most stories have a sole protagonist, or a main character that experiences the central conflict directly. In Kamen Rider, for the most part, these protagonists are our primary writers. They're the ones who get the most focus. Be it a plot-driven show or a character-driven one, it's still their story at the end of the day. Some works will have a deuteragonist, who is the second most important character in the story. These are usually our secondary writers, especially in shows like Ryuki or Build, but a secondary writer is not always the deuteragonist. In O's, for example, the character that fills that role is Ankh, and in Blade, it's Hajime, who is the tertiary writer from a legal perspective, even if Toei isn't always sure about that themselves. And of course, a story needs to have an antagonist, although an antagonist is not necessarily a character. There are many different kinds of conflict, and man versus man is just one of at least 4 of them. An antagonist's role is to oppose the protagonist, simple as that. This doesn't mean that an antagonist is necessarily a villain. An antagonist, if it's a person at all, just needs to be against the main character in some way. Hart from Kamen Rider Drive, for example, is certainly an antagonist, but he doesn't view himself as a villain, and neither do I. At the end of the day, all he really wants is for his people to live and to be able to rise up against their oppressors. But a lot of the time, yeah, your antagonist is also going to be your main villain. Swartz and Zio, Ivolto and Build, you all know how it goes. After your protagonists, deuterogonists, and antagonists, things get a little more fuzzy. For one thing, you'll have your tertiary characters, who are definitely part of the story, they just don't really interact with it the way that the other guys do. These are not your tertiary writers. These are people like Kotaro from Blade or the beat writers from Gaim who don't get belts. They exist, and they have a role, which is to flesh out the world around the more major characters. They just aren't really involved with the plot. On the other hand, most tertiary writers take the role of tritagonists, which is a word so niche that my autocorrect kept changing it to protagonist while I was writing this script. Usually, the third most important character in a story is the antagonist, but especially in modern writer, where it's common for us to have 3 or more writers and larger ensemble casts in general, it's just as likely that the third most important character is one of the heroes. I'd put Tachibana from Blade here, along with characters like Taiga from Ex-Aid or Tsukiyomi from Zio. Now, the amount of importance a character has in a story isn't the only way to define them. Certain general archetypes exist in fiction in a lot of different forms, and those forms absolutely show up in writer. Heroes, mentors, love interests, confidants, comic relief characters. The list could go on for the rest of the length of this video. But the thing about long-running shows and franchises like Writer is, like I said, they usually end up developing archetypes of their own. Look at Pokemon, for example. Every generation has a rival, a cute electric rodent, and a starter trio in grass, fire, and water. Kamen Rider is very much the same thing. So let's kick this off with the archetypes that define our protagonists, or as most of us call them,
The primaries.
Now, before we really get into the sorting, the first thing we need is a framework. Something we can use to define, well, how we're going to define them. For our primary writers, the framework I've decided on is pretty simple. What lesson do these characters teach the kids watching? See, at the end of the day, all we writer nerds are, in fact, being nerds about a kids show, and when you keep that in mind while you're watching, it's really easy to sort the characters into archetypes based on what the kids who make up that target audience would pick up from watching them. So firstly, we have an archetype I call the guy with a job. In this category, I have Shotaro from Double, Gentaro from Forze, Shinosuke from Drive, Emu from Ex-Aid, Sento from Build, Aruto from 01, and Toma from Saber. Basically, if you would describe a Kamen Rider season as, it's about an insert profession here, that's where it goes. In the fanfic/retelling Shadowjack Watches Sailor Moon, there's a really interesting point he made about Usagi's usage of the disguise pen. Everything she transforms into is a potential future for the girls watching. The guy with a job does the same thing. They show the kids watching something that they can be in the future, be it a cop, a scientist, or a CEO. What these characters teach is the ups and downs of these professions, while showing exactly how to be a hero while being one. Of course, some of these professions are more likely than others. Most kids aren't going to grow up to be CEOs. But they still show that they're things that a kid watching can become. I think that Emu is the strongest example of this, as you can tell by the fact that I'm using music from Dr. Mario as the background while I'm talking about this. Ex-Aid is a medical drama as much as it is a Henshin hero series, and because of that, it has a far more realistic depiction of the medical world than it strictly had to. Emu is a rookie, and he's got a lot to learn. He grows into a stronger doctor over the course of the series, both in terms of what he can do relating to medical procedures, and how he deals with things like not being able to save every single patient. A kid watching won't get a romanticized view of what it means to be a doctor. They'll get a realistic view, and that's just as important. Another aspect of Emu's character that I think is extremely important to note in regards to the message he's sending to kids is the fact that he's chronically ill. When you strip away all of the Kamen Rider plot attached to it, fact is, he's been sick since he was a kid, and not every kid watching Kamen Rider is perfectly healthy. Emu also shows that, even if that's the case, you can still grow up and be a doctor and save people. Now, you may also be thinking, Laura, a high school student isn't a job, why is Gentaro here? Well, while it's true that high school students don't get paid for going there, for an elementary school student who's watching Writer, being a high school student with a lot of friends having fun doing club activities is still a potential future. It's also worth noting that Forzay's forms are based on professions as well. In base states, he's an astronaut. Elect states is a construction worker. Fire states is a firefighter. And magnet states is a scientist. And that job coding is very much intentional. Forzay was meant to be a more light-hearted and hopeful series in the wake of the 2011 earthquake and tsunami, and showing kids that they have a bright future every step of the way was a way of giving kids that hope. Kamen Rider Saber, being our mid and also post-COVID writer season, does something similar with Toma being a novelist. Saber is about the power of stories, and during a time when kids were locked inside, stories and escapism were essential for staying sane. The finale of Saber shows this through that amazing sequence where fans and the cast of Saber talk about their favorite stories while Toma's in the Wonderworld. Through Toma being a novelist, however, kids also learn that their stories are important too. They're the words that can save this world. Now, I would not say that writer always succeeds at this, because Drive is a show, and I don't really think that Drive would make any kid want to be a cop. On some level, of course, that's personal bias due to my varied and complicated feelings regarding Drive as a series, but at the same time, Shinosuke has to spend a lot of time working around the limitations of the system he's in. The corruption in his department is a plot point, and unfortunately, a corrupt police department has a lot more in common with reality than a police department that's, good. But at the same time, the fictional ideal of a good cop exists. Ideally, if a kid does want to become a cop, they'll emulate Shinosuke and not any actual cop. The second archetype I've outlined for our primary writers is what I call the tragic nice boy. In this category, I have Hongo Takeshi himself, Kenzaki from Blade, Eiji from O's, Haruto from Wizard, and Shoma from Gav. As I've mentioned previously on this channel, and also in the previously on segment of this video, I'm a sucker for a character whose spurts of heroism due to a tragic past. This archetype is basically that. What these characters teach kids is that no matter how rough things may be for them, they can still choose kindness and to be good. Kids go through all kinds of rough stuff. Divorce, illness, family deaths, abuse. It's not always easy to grow up. That's why it's important for them to see characters who had it rough and came out the other side. Now, I'm not actually finished with the original Kamen Rider, but Hongo still fits in this category. His tragic past is just also the really recent past. Some of the scenes that have resonated with me the most so far are Hongo's struggles with his strength post-cyborgification. There's one episode where he tries to comfort a little boy, only to inadvertently injure his hand, but Hongo still saves the day and helps the little boy. This archetype has been with Ryder since the very beginning. My complaints about Gav aside, Shoma fits here too. The abuse he suffered at the hands of the Stomach family is exactly why he's so determined to take his family down, as painful as that is for him. With Kenzaki, it's only touched on briefly, but he lost his entire family in a fire. That's what gives him the motivation to protect people as a Kamen Rider when the series starts, and this desire to protect people is what leads him to make that final decision. And with Haruto, well, he didn't just lose his family. He was also straight up kidnapped and used as a potential sacrifice by the White Wizard. His parents' wishes for him to not lose hope led him to becoming that hope for the people he saves. Eiji from O's, however, is probably my favorite example of this archetype because he's both an example of it and a deconstruction of it. Eiji's inadvertent worsening of the war he witnessed in Africa, his failure to save the little girl he'd befriended there, and his father's use of Eiji's pain for his political campaign did, in fact, lead him to heroism. He's made it his mission in life to help everyone that he can reach, because if he doesn't, the regret could kill him. At the same time, however, as a result of his trauma, he's depressed. And his lack of desire is what makes him a perfect vessel for the purple metals that are slowly turning him into a greed. That, however, is another place where O's succeeds in its messaging. Eiji is inadvertently reminded by Ankh giving it to him that what he wanted was the power to reach everyone in the world and help them. And in the finale, Ankh's sacrifice doesn't just save Eiji's life. It shows Eiji that what he really needs to obtain that power is to be connected with the people around him. It's doubtful that any children watching Rider ended up accidentally funding a civil war, and statistically speaking, they're probably not the children of terrible politicians either. But showing kids who have been through terrible things that the way to survive is to not take all the responsibility on their own shoulders and actually rely on their friends is incredibly important. The third archetype I've outlined is what I like to call just a little guy. In this category, we have Wataru from Kiva, Philip from Double, Takeru from Ghost, Sogo from Zio, and Hotaro from Gotchard. These characters might not start out heroic, And they definitely don't start knowing everything there is about the world around them, but that's the point. Their learning and growing is the journey. The kids watching see someone who's more like them than a grown man would be, and therefore they see someone they can relate to turning into a hero. At first, I actually had Takeru from Ghost under the tragic nice boy category, and he does qualify there too. A lot of his heroism is because of his father's death, and also, he does in fact die 5 times, so he sure goes through the ringer. But I decided to put him under this category because the very first lesson that Takeru learns is that, if he wants to stay corporeal, he has to believe in himself. Philip also isn't really a standard example. He has a lot more in common with an archetype I'll discuss a little later in this video. But as we learn through watching the Double Winter movie, he starts out nameless, kind of already dead, and not knowing his purpose, if any. It's through Skull and through working with Shotaro that he develops his own values and ideals. Wataru from Kiva also has his learning and growing baked into his show's themes. To paraphrase the best part of Kiva, namely the song Break the Chain, nothing will start if he stays hidden in his house, and if he has to break the metaphorical chains, he has to change. I hate Kiva! It is my least favorite writer season ever, but I will say that it succeeds at this. Wataru breaking out of his shell, falling for Mio, losing her, and choosing to live on despite his guilt and grief actually makes for really excellent character growth. If you can ignore all the Kiva that's surrounding it. My son Hotaro from Gotchard is the Reiwa era's sole example of this thus far, and that's intentional. After seasons starring a CEO, a novelist, Igarashi Iki, and a pro Fortnite player, the writers wanted to scale back and have a protagonist who is a little less spectacular. At the beginning of Gotchard, Hotaro's still searching for his gacha. He doesn't know what he wants to be yet, and he finds that dream in the form of alchemy. His journey throughout Gotchard is about him coming into his own as an alchemist, as well as refining that dream. By the end, he wants to create a world where humans and chemis can live together in harmony. He doesn't accomplish that dream right away, of course, but to paraphrase his favorite song, My Revolution, if you're going to chase your dreams, you can't just give up that easily. He sure falls down a lot, but the important thing is that he gets up again. My favorite example of this archetype, however, is my other son, Tokiwa Sogo. What's interesting about Sogo is that, at the beginning of his series, while he seems nice enough, he's still on the path that's going to lead him to become Omizio. Without Gates, Tsukiyomi, his uncle, and the lessons he learns from the legend writers, he'll always end up being the Demon King who destroys the world. It also takes him a while to actually believe that he'll become said evil king, and as Omizio, he believes he's saved the world, not destroyed it. But that's a feature of Zio, not a bug. Sogo has to learn that he is, in fact, capable of evil in order for him to choose to be good. He has to accept that there is darkness inside of him to get Zio too, and he has to learn that it's important for him to be able to admit that he's struggling in order to deal with his final duel that wasn't with Gates. By the end of Zio, Sogo's gone from a lonely boy that thinks that good intentions are enough, going down an incredibly dark path, to someone who's sacrificed the dream he's clung to precisely to cope with that in order to bring peace to the world and happiness to the people closest to him. For archetype number 4, we have what I like to call the Everydude. In this category, we have Shinji from Yuki, Ryotaro from Deno, Kota from Gaim, and my dear husband Igarashi Iki from Kamen Rider Revice. These characters are just guys. People who are nice enough and like helping people. The lesson they teach is that anyone can be a hero. Now, you may ask, Laura, why isn't Shinji under guy with a job? And to that I'd answer, Kido Shinji is never a character that you'd first describe as a journalist. You'd first describe him as an idiot. But that in itself is where the lesson with Shinji lies. You don't have to be the smartest guy in the room to be a hero. It takes Shinji the whole series to even think of a wish he's willing to die for, and even then, he doesn't exactly live long enough to fight for it. But he also spends all of Ryuki trying to help innocent people who become the victims of the mirror monsters. Even when he's not sure of what he wants, he's still doing the right thing, and being selfless in a series that really punishes that. Ryotaro from Deno also shows this. He might be ridiculously unlucky, but he's a sweetheart who wants to help people, especially his sister. He also has some traits in common with the little guys I outlined previously. He has to learn that he's important, but I still put him under the Everydude, because through Ryotaro, kids learn that misfortune is gonna happen to you, but that's no reason to give up. Kota, being the 2.0 version of Shinji, is also an extremely strong example of this archetype. When Kota gets his belt, even though he doesn't know what it is or what he's about to get involved in, he sure knows that he wants to use it to protect people. Sure, there's the brief period at the beginning of the series where Kota's also using said belt to win invest games, But he learns the hard way that having this power isn't just fun and games. But no matter how much it costs him, and no matter how much pain it causes, Kota stays determined to protect the people he loves. And putting Iki here... As the guy who's thought about Igarashi Iki more than anyone else on planet Earth, I can say that I put him here for a reason. It's true that his grandfather is an alien perceived by humans as a demon, but he's still an everydude because he believes that's who he should be. The reliable big brother who takes care of the bathhouse and saves everyone, even if he means he doesn't have any goals outside of that. He'll shoulder burdens so that other people don't have to. And he'll ignore his own needs and stressors if it means keeping peace for everyone else. But his nosiness, and his drive to save people is ultimately selfish. It's called out on a few occasions that he's being a savior because of his ego, and he lights himself on fire when he fails at that because he's put so much of his identity into being the guy that saves people. He wants to help others, yes, but he doesn't start off the best at understanding the emotions of the people he wants to save. The fact that he'll help you out whether you want it or not is one of the many things I absolutely adore about him, but his journey is one that has two main facets, and one of them is acknowledging the fact that he's not always the right person to save everyone. This brings us to our last archetype, the Egoist. In this category, we have Tendo from Kabuto, Tsukasa from Decade, Vice from Revice, and Ace from Geats. These characters are good at what they do, and they know they're good at what they do. The lesson that they teach is that confidence in yourself doesn't have to mean cruelty towards others. I think that Tendo is the strongest example of this archetype. He's often written off as just the guy who's awesome at everything he does, to the point where I've seen people call him a Gary Stu without a shred of irony, but actually watching Kabuto will reveal to you that he's also the guy with a heart full of love. His relationships with his sisters, and especially with Hiyori in my opinion, really exemplify this. If you watch Kabuto and don't pick up on how much he loves, respects, and cares about them, I'd recommend watching Kabuto again. I'm also someone who's a firm believer that cooking for someone is the greatest way to express your love for them. Everyone needs to eat food to live, and by cooking for someone, you're basically helping them live and making sure they enjoy it while you're at it. And remember that time when he was like, "No, Kagami, we're not friends, let me cook for you?" That was an expression of love in a very, very Tendo font. Tsukasa is kind of an interesting example of this archetype because he's excellent at everything and can do pretty much anything depending on the situation he's put in, except of course his actual job. His adaptability kind of makes him an example of a guy with a job too. Almost every situation he's thrown into is a potential future for the kids journeying through the decade. But his personality is, well, his personality. He's blunt as hell and he knows how often he's right. But beneath all of that, and beneath the kindness he shows when he chooses to show it, Tsukasa's dealing with angst of his own. He has no story, no world to call his home, and in at least one world, his purpose is to be the evil that the other Kamen Riders have to defeat. For a kid that moves around a lot, or one who's maybe not the strongest in terms of social skills, they won't just see Tsukasa's confidence. They'll see the fact that he's on a journey that doesn't have an end, and that's a rough fucking time. A lot of his confidence is more or less just a front for his loneliness, but even as he's thrown into world after world, he still figures out how to save the day and protect his friends. Now, Vice is in this category not just because he's an egoist. He's in this category because he is, quite literally, Iki's suppressed ego. Iki's trauma from overworking himself to make Jiko's soccer dream come true, combined with his drive to be reliable, means that he's spent years pressing down every selfish desire he's had. And because of the aforementioned alien demon grandfather, those selfish desires became Vice. I also think it's important to note the circumstances of Vice's birth. Young Iki watched his veil-possessed father burn down the original Happy Spa, and Vice came out because Iki couldn't protect them. Of course, a demon who was literally born out of Iki's desire to protect his family would also be shaped by everything that Iki pushes down due to Iki feeling the need to do so. Vice cries when Iki is stoic. He's loud and flashy when Iki is more calm and collected. You can even see this contrast in their fighting styles. Vice uses a lot of wrestling moves which are inherently showy, while Iki uses karate which is more disciplined. He's every part of Iki that Iki thinks is annoying, all wrapped up in one guy. And with the also aforementioned Iki lights himself on fire when he fails to save someone thing, it's only through acknowledging that yes, his desire to save people is a selfish one, and that Vice, with all of his annoyingness and showboating, is a part of him, that he can actually successfully use Volcano. Revice doesn't just show that having an ego doesn't mean cruelty. It shows that having a selfish side is what makes you a whole human person, and a lot of the time, that selfish side is exactly what's protecting you. The way Iki and Vice slowly learn to trust each other, which is really just Iki learning to trust and love himself, is one of the many reasons why Revice is so special to me. But it's not just Vice that Iki plays off of. See, Writer isn't just about the primary writers. This brings us to...
The secondaries.
Now, secondary writers also exist to teach kids lessons. Most characters do because, again, Kamen Writer is for elementary schoolers. But that's not the framework that I'm going to be using for dividing our secondary writers into archetypes, because secondaries have a different role as well. They must contrast the primary in some way. That contrast is vital because it creates conflict outside of what's happening with the primary writer and the main antagonists. Through that conflict, the primary writers and the secondary writers both grow. So, I've isolated 5 archetypes of secondary writers based on precisely how that contrast manifests. First off, we have Grieving and Grumpy. This category is a big one. We have Ren from Ryuki, Yuta from Zeno, Ryu from Double, Ryusei from Forze, Kaito from Guy, Hiro from Exade, Gates from Zio, and Hanto from Gov. These characters have all experienced some kind of loss, be it friends, family, or the girlfriend they're definitely in love with, and as a result, they've turned some flavor of grumpy about it. They generally contrast with the primaries by being cynical where the primary is idealistic, or mean when the primary is nice, or brooding when the primary is smiley. And in the eyes of the kids watching, they might even be seen as cool. But what these characters also have in common is that, for the most part, they soften over time thanks to the influence of the primary as well as the characters around them. Kaito, for example, ends up being the last boss that Kota has to face in Gaim, yes, but to say he doesn't soften a little because of Kota would be inaccurate. He cares about the guy enough to pop out of nowhere to save him all the time. Ryu from Double is also an example of this, and a hilarious one at that. In his very first two-parter, he gets really normal about Shotaro being way too naive, but it's also thanks to Shotaro's influence that he doesn't commit police brutality in that same two-parter. Ryusei is a rare secondary writer that I'm not very fond of, but he still qualifies. He starts off solely wanting to wake up his friend, baby Hikari from Tokyo-jer, and Gentaro can tell that his smile is fake. It might take killing Gentaro for him to get there, but his honesty about his feelings when that's all over with is how he actually joins the Kamen Rider Club. Hiro, on the other hand, is a character I'm incredibly fond of, as I have made clear on several occasions. His coldness isn't the only way he contrasts with Emu, and we'll get into that, but his complete inability to process his own guilt and grief over Saki's death is what makes his character. His ridiculous competence as a surgeon is a direct result of him internalizing her last words. Like I said, this isn't the only way he contrasts with Emu, and we'll get into that, but it's Hiro who tells Emu that dealing with death is also a part of being a doctor. Which is hilarious considering the fact that Hiro is very much not dealing with the death that affected him. Gates is another character I adore, and it's actually not solely because of how ridiculously transparent his giant crush on Sogo is. Gates is a soldier. In the wasteland that Omazios created in 2068, he's lost friends, comrades, and family. When he comes to 2018 to kill Sogo, all he's known is war and suffering. Sogo doesn't just soften Gates through kindness, however. He also is the reason that Gates grows to see that a peaceful future made by the two of them is possible. And in the Gates Majesty V cinema, even without his full memories of the events of Zio, he trusts Sogo's goodness above all. Gates, in turn, is also vital to Sogo's development. He straight up says that he needs Gates in order to be a good king, and his trust that Gates will take him down if necessary, even though we all know that Gates is down too bad to actually do it, is proof that the importance of that bond stretches both ways. In Yuto's case, he's a bit complicated. I'm putting him under Grieving and Grumpy at the suggestion of my train consultant, but really, he could go into several of these categories thanks to how involved he is with Deno's overall story. But in the end, Ryotaro's primary trait is that he's a sweet boy who you want to protect, and Yuto's is that he tries really hard to convince you that he doesn't care when he really obviously does. His grumpiness is very much a front, and that's what he has in common with the other dudes in this category. Ren from Ryuki, however, is the example of this that kind of made the blueprint for the rest of them. Especially as someone who studied Ryuki more than almost anyone else on Earth, I can say that his contrast with Shinji and his growth because of Shinji is one of the absolute best parts of Ryuki. The Ren at the end of the series who holds Shinji's hand and begs him to live is not the same grumpy, 2002 repressed Ren we meet in the first episode. And it's thanks to Ren that Shinji learns exactly what the Rider War is and what it's like to have a wish you're willing to die for. The way their characters influence each other makes them the blueprint for this primary-secondary dynamic. I really don't blame Toei for doing Ren Shinji in different fonts so often. Clearly it works. Next up, we have what I like to call the guy in the system. In this category, we have Kagami from Kabuto, Nago from Kiba, Goto-chan from O's, Rintaro from Saber, Daiji from Revice, and Rine from Gotthard. This archetype contrasts with the primary by being involved in structured organizations, while their associated primary has less experience in whatever it is they're dealing with. Like I mentioned, Hiro has shades of this archetype too. He is, after all, the genius surgeon to Emu's genius gamer. That said, I am also an Emuhi enthusiast who thinks about my cat too much, which is why he went in the previous category instead. One thing I find interesting about this archetype is that, in a lot of cases, they aren't powered up right away despite their experience and knowledge. Goto-chan was the secondary I was thinking about when I first identified this archetype, which is interesting seeing as he spends the majority of O's as a non-powered combatant. He doesn't actually get the belt until the end of the second arc, and he has to earn it, although he wants it more than anything. He has to learn to swallow his pride and just go after it in order to do so. This contrasts Eiji, who also wanted power to help people but forgot that desire before the series started. Ankh gave that power to Eiji out of convenience, not because he'd worked for it. Kagami is also an example of a character who's involved with the organization his show is centered around, but doesn't get his power right away. Poor puppy had a bad habit of not being chosen by Zectors before the Gatack one finally did. That, however, is what makes his debut as Gatack so damn cool and so satisfying. As viewers, we've watched our guy get beat, rejected, and generally suffering, so when he goes all blue and says he can only be himself but he is who he is, it's a victory for the audience as much as it is for him. Rine from Gotthard is a modern example of this archetype who I also think is excellent. She's really classic secondary writer writing, just with a different gender from the rest. Like Goto-chan, she starts out knowing more than Hotaro. She was raised in the world of alchemy, and even without a belt of her own, she's good at what she does. But not only does her cold exterior soften thanks to Hotaro, with her wanting the power to support him the way that he supported her, Rine's arc is very much about the choice to discard the strict rules of the world she was raised in and fight in her own way. Daiji is also a really interesting Reiwa-era example of this archetype because the fact that he doesn't get his power right away despite working for it is what sets off so much of his character growth. His jealousy over Iki, and his subconscious wish to kill his brother for always stealing the attention, is what births Kagero. Daiji's initial rejection and later acceptance of that side of him is what his whole character arc is. Daiji's whole story is about accepting that erasing your evil side doesn't make you a perfect person, and that thinking that it does is a one-way ticket to believing that you're right all the time when you're really not. Now, Rintaro subverts the they get their powers later aspect of the archetype. He has a sacred sword from the moment he lions into Fantastic Bookstore. But his contrast with Toma begins thanks to the fact that he was raised with the Sword of Logos, while Toma just got here. And again, it's realizing the rot within the organization and going against everything he's ever known that makes most of Rintaro's character arc. A lot of the time for this archetype, it's the influence of the primary that lets them break the metaphorical chains binding them. After our guys in the system, we have our goofballs. In this category, we have Daiki from Decade, Nito from Wizard, Go from Drive, and Banjo from Build. These characters usually have more serious primary writers, and though this doesn't disqualify them from having angst of their own, they generally contrast their primaries by being more lighthearted. Nito, for example, rolls into Wizard with a Mayo obsession and internalized homophobia absolutely kicking his ass. Haruto's not gloomy or grumpy, but he is serious about hope and saving people. Nito contrasts this by fighting phantoms because he'd rather have a chance of dying at any time whatsoever than having a guy putting a ring on his finger. He matures a lot through his rivalry with Haruto, however, and he makes a pretty big sacrifice at the end to help save the world. Daiki has his serious moments, of course, including his gay marriage proposal at the end of Decade, but compared to Tsukasa, he's still more in a comic relief kind of role with his flirting and thievery. Banjo from Build is the platonic ideal of a himbo, and his muscle-headedness contrasts with Sento's intelligence, but he too gets serious moments, and he's so entwined with Build's lore and story that he's vital for reasons beyond his himbo-ness. When I isolated this archetype, though, I was thinking about one Shijima Go. Go is a character that I see a lot of myself in, and I hate that I do. Absolutely hate it. But, well, let's look at the material here. In Go's debut episodes, he's annoying. He is not working with the police due to being a 19-year-old who just got to Japan, and he's open about the advantages of that. He is doing backflips and setting up all this flashiness for his first henshin and that catchphrase. You know in Climax Scramble, Go says his entire catchphrase even when he's brainwashed? Anyway, the point is, Go starts out doing the absolute most, and he's doing all of that for a reason. He really doesn't want Kiriko to worry. If her little brother is strong and never hitting the brakes, she won't question what he's doing. And what he's doing, trying to fix what he believes is his father's mistake by killing all the roid mutants, is the exact kind of thing she would question if she knew why he was doing it. That's what makes it so good when the cracks start showing in his facade, especially at the beginning of the third arc. We learn in one of the Drive novels that he was grieving a friend of his from the States who'd been killed by roid mutants before his first appearance. His jealousy towards Chase for being so damn good, and his hatred of Chase for being a roid mute that canonically turns into attraction makes him slip hard, and he spends a lot of the latter half of Drive breaking down and suffering. The knowledge that his father was an absolutely fucking terrible person doesn't sit well with him either, of course. And then Chase explodes right in front of him in a heroic sacrifice. It's really no wonder that in every post-Drive Go appearance, even the one where he actively kisses a woman, he's trying desperately to atone for how terribly he treated Chase by bringing him back to life. Even this contrasts Shinosuke, who spends Drive post-canon happily married with a kid. For our fourth secondary writer archetype, we have the older dude with an issue of some kind. In this category, we have Tachibana from Blade, Date from O's, Makoto from Ghost, and Fuwa from 01. The arcs these characters go through are usually a little more detached from the primary writers than ones of other secondary writer archetypes. They have issues of their own to deal with. Once those issues get worked through though, they cool. My pathetic dog boyfriend Fuwa, for example, would have gone into Grieving and Grumpy if what he believed was his backstory actually was his backstory. Neither he nor the audience know for most of the show that his tragic Humagear backstory was an invention of Trousers. Thowsers, to foster Fuwa's hatred for them. He's less tied to Aruto's storyline and more tied to those of Yua and the folks at metsubojinrai.net, but at the end of 01, he recognizes the path that Aruto's going down with his desire for revenge since he's lived it and tries to snap him out of it. Makoto is similar. He's not grieving, but he's grumpy until Kanon gets rescued from the icon she's in. He mellows out severely after she's rescued, and though a lot of his plot after that has a lot to do with Alan's storyline, he's still staunchly an ally of Takeru's. Date from O's is an interesting example. He doesn't just contrast Eiji by being older than him and having an issue. He also has what Eiji lacks. A strong desire, and specifically, a selfish desire for 100 million yen. The characters initially believed that it's so Date can fund a medical school, but nope. He needs that cash to get the bullet that is in his skull out of his skull. Date is fully aware of the fact that his desire is selfish as well as how important his own life is, and as a result, he's the one who calls Eiji out for being selfless to the point of self-destruction. He also serves as a boyfriend, that is to say, a mentor figure to Goto-chan, which lines up with his archetypes. A lot of their story is about a writer who's not the primary thing. But there's been an example of this archetype peeking around this corner the whole time. That example is Tachibana-san. For one thing, he is older than Kenzaki, and is also his senior in the whole Kamen Rider business. And secondly, well, what does this guy not go through? He eats a puzzle piece. He gets addicted to the wheat tank. He believes that his body is falling apart. He's briefly a traitor. He let he let Sayoko die. There is just so much that this guy is going through at any given time. What helps bring Tachibana out of his everything that is always happening is his relationship with Mutsuki. Becoming the kid's older brother figure really helps him get his head back on straight after Sayoko's death, and as a result, we have the relatively well-adjusted Tachibana who exists in Outsiders and other post-canon Blade stuff. And lastly, we have... I don't know where to put them. These are characters that I don't know where to put them. And in this category, we have Kagero from Revice and Keiwa from Geats. With Keiwa, it's an issue of, I'm already controversial enough on this channel and I don't want to go through my incredibly complicated relationship with Sakurai Keiwa as a character. And with Kagero, well, Kagero is kind of a unique example because the character he's meant to contrast with is who Daiji believes he should be. I guess you could compare him to Vice as well, since Vice is a monster who openly thirsts for attention and only briefly gets to possess Iki, while Kagero is an e-boy who takes Daiji over when he feels like it. But at the same time, looking at Kagero's position in Revice's narrative, as well as what his overall role in Revice's story is, he exists so that Daiji can grow by accepting him. But Revice, like a lot of writer seasons, doesn't just stop at two writers to play off of each other. Which brings us to...
Tertiaries, quaternaries, and beyond.
Because Kamen Rider's goal, outside of teaching kids various lessons, is to sell toys, a lot of the time, you're going to have a lot more writers with various levels of plot importance. Unlike the last two categories, I don't really have a rigid framework for sorting them. It's more like, here are some patterns I've noticed, and here are some characters that fit that pattern. First off, we have the fourth writer who dies and comes back hotter. In this category, we have Takatora from Gaim, Kiria from Egoist, and Hiromi from Revice. What these characters have in common is that they're the fourth writers for their respective seasons, they die, and then they come back way hotter than they were previously. Like, the whole first half of Revice, Hiromi's kind of a dork, and then he survives getting thrown off a cliff and proceeds to look stupidly good in Battle Familia. And that black leather jacket is a whole look on Kiria, and Takatora just looks really good with his clothes all torn up after his cliff shoving. The lesson learned from these characters is... sometimes in this life, in order to get up from rock bottom, you need to get yourself a new fit. Next up, we have an archetype I like to call Who Let a Teenager In Here? In this category, we have Tiger from Ryuki, Mutsuki from Blade, Michi from Gaim, and Ren from Saber. Go from Drive also hangs out here because a lot of his choices are easily explained by how 19 years old he is. These characters are defined by the fact that they're teenagers, or at least very young adults, and they really should have grown up a little more before they got their belts. The lesson that the kids at home get is that there's a lot in this world that should really be left to the grown-ups. Yes, being a kamen writer looks ridiculously cool and badass, but it's also scary as hell. There are some things that it's a really, really bad idea to let kids do, and these characters show what happens when you let kids do them anyway. If Tiger was older, for example, maybe he wouldn't have ended up misunderstanding the trolley problem and making it his entire personality as well as murder motive. Mutsuki's storyline is probably the most explicit about him being way too young to do this. People try to convince him on multiple occasions not to do the whole kamen writer thing because he's too 15 years old and he does not listen, which leads to a lot of problems for everyone. With Michi and Ren, it's more subtle. In Michi's case, well, he's in Gaim. Gaim is a coming-of-age story, so all the characters grow up or don't to some degree. Michi, however, despite being the youngest out of the writers we're introduced to, thinks he's already grown up, and due to perceiving himself as way smarter and more mature than he actually is, he makes a lot of mistakes, and everything he's worked for comes crumbling down around him. Gaim's got an optimistic ending overall, however, and Michi gets a chance to redeem himself and learn from his mistakes. On the other hand, with Ren... For one thing, it's clear visually that he's the youngest at the Sword of Logos, and his desperation to get stronger and to get Kento to notice him makes up his character. His angry outbursts, his moments of quieter sadness, his giant crush that grown adult man Toma clocks right away. Ren is so goddamn teenage boy. And as a result, he has teenage boy typical self-loathing that is just all over his story. He seeks approval, and he tries so hard to be like the other people around him, which is also teenager behavior. When you're young, and you don't have a strong sense of self yet, those are the exact things you seek. If he was a little older, or at least was better at emotional regulation, he'd probably have a way easier time with all of that. Now, for most teenagers, the solution to these problems isn't to start a homoerotic rivalry with a monster who's made of ink, but, well, as far as I know, ADHD medication doesn't exist in the Saber universe, so it's fine that they gave him the next best thing. After that, we have... women. What defines these writers is the fact that they're women, and in this category we have every female writer not named Kudo Rine. I'm not trying to say that all female writers are the same. They're very not. Yua from 01, for example, has way more in common with Yoko from Gaim than she does, say, Nadeshiko from Forze, and Sakura from Revice is way more aligned with Mayu from Wizard than she is with Miho from Ryuki. Takahashi Yuya also has his Navigator Girl writers, Poppy and Izu, and characters like Reika from Saber and Hana from Revice also get their antagonist to hero arcs. I'm not saying every single female writer has the same personality, or growth, or even plot importance. It varies. We take steps forward, we take steps back. That said, aside from Rine, who's different from the others by virtue of being a secondary writer, and therefore being written like a secondary first and a girl as a close second, these characters are treated by the narrative as, hey, look, girl writer, look how cool this is, buy our toys. That is their whole deal. It's not great, but historically, writers' treatment of its women hasn't been great either. Fourth on this ridiculous list is what I call the magical pretty boy. In this category, we have Hajime from Blade, an honorary member in the form of Kengo from Forze, Ankh from O's, Chase from Drive, Alan from Ghost, Palado from Egoist, and Jin from 01. And remember how I mentioned that Philip also had something in common with a category I hadn't mentioned yet? Yeah, it's this one. If you've seen all these shows, you'll know exactly what these guys have in common. They're not technically human, and tragedy will strike them. They also often, but not always, have something a little bit gay going on, and in the cases of Hajime, Kengo, and Ankh, They're more the deuterogonist of their stories than the secondary writer is. What I find really interesting about these characters is the fact that, a lot of the time, their story is about learning to be human. With Kengo, since the reveal about him being the core child doesn't come until the very end of Forze, it's more subtle, but he does start out being cold and standoffish. Thanks to Gentaro's influence, of course, he softens and makes genuine friends, taking him out of his isolation and giving him one of the most important parts of the human experience: connection. With Hajime, the human undead himself gave him the chance to experience human life, and when Blade starts, he's already bonded with the Kurihara family. There's no doubt in Kenzaki's mind that Hajime is a person, even if he isn't human, and that's what drives Kenzaki to sacrifice his own humanity so that Hajime can keep living as one. Ankh is an interesting example, because he wants to live, and the fact that he's something that's technically an object possessing a human body who is living isn't something that he wants to give up, though he eventually concedes. Thanks to Eiji and Hina viewing his cessation of existence as a death, however, he does in fact get to die, which is proof that he lived. Chase is similar. He's described as admiring humans, shown learning human rules, and he unlocks human emotions as well. One of his last moves before exploding in front of Go and changing the trajectory of his life forever is to give Go Signal Chaser and his license, because they were given to him by his human friends. Unlike Eiji, Go has spent most of Drive up to this point being vitriolic in his hatred of Chase and refusing to acknowledge Chase's humanity at all. But once Chase is gone, well, Go never really says he's mourning, but he wouldn't be working himself like this if he didn't feel immense grief and guilt over Chase. Their storyline is about Chase learning to be human, yes, but it's also about Go, and by extension the kids watching Drive, learning about accepting the other. Alan and Palado's storylines also have to do with death in different ways. With Alan, he barely knows what it's like to have a human body, and he's forced to rethink his entire outlook on life after he loses his father, his title, and a lot of his powers. Grandma Fumi passing away doesn't really help his mental state either. But that grief, though he initially rejects it, is the impetus for him becoming a heroic character. With Palado, he's the manifestation of Emu's competitiveness and mad gaming skills. He doesn't value life because he's a game character, so why would he? Until Emu just goes ahead and kills him. Palado gets better, of course, but that's what's preventing him from being a hero for most of Xaid. Emu does not fuck around when it comes to the value of life, and that's been the central tension in their relationship up to that point. In Jin's case, he starts out as another take on Palado's specific flavor of this archetype. He's childish and dangerous in equal measure. After he dies and gets better, he believes that his fellow Humagears shouldn't serve humans or the Ark. His goal is to make his own path. That's vital to Aruto's character development, since their encounters help Aruto realize that Humagears deserve individuality too. It's once again teaching, understanding, and acceptance of the other. And then at the end of 01, there's the whole thing about how Aruto killing Jin by accident just made the cycle of revenge start again, and that's bad, but... well, I'm going to save my thoughts on the end of 01 for another day. Next up, we have our otherwise relatively normal men broken by the events. In this category, we have the Hellhoppers from Kabuto, Taiga from Xaid, Kento from Saber, Spanner from Gotchard, and Lakia from Gav. If the events of their seasons hadn't happened to them, it's extremely likely these guys would be relatively normal people. Or as normal as you can be as a swordsman or an alchemist in the cases of Kento and Spanner. But, well, the events of the show had to happen to them, now we all have to deal with the consequences. When I isolated this archetype, I was specifically thinking about Taiga and Kento. Taiga was a normal radiologist, and a damn talented one at that, until he spotted what we now know to be the Buckster virus, and was picked to be the first Kamen Rider. He lost everything, from his license to the pigmentation in his hair, thanks to failing to save Momose Saki, all because he accidentally caught the attention of Don Kuroto. Kento has a less normal starting place because, like I said, he's a swordsman, but if he hadn't been trapped in the death loop, he'd probably spend more time being the nice guy he's introduced as opposed to the well-intentioned extremist that he becomes as a result of repeatedly watching everyone he loves die. With Lakia, the way the events of the show break him is unfortunately fairly realistic. His little brother got addicted to dark treats and was killed. I dislike Gav's portrayal of addiction, and I don't think Komel deserved to die, but Lakia's desire for revenge is the reason he's in the plot in the first place. He would not be here in any capacity if that one little thing hadn't happened to him. For Spanner, he's been repressing the trauma of watching his parents die for years, and during the events of Gotchard, that trauma does what trauma does best. It unrepresses itself, which really doesn't do much for his mental state. If Spanner hadn't been born into a world that has alchemy and 2 alchemist parents, he'd probably just be a really good chef somewhere. But again, he just had to get that chard. And the Hellhoppers getting beat up and fired is exactly what led them to be the emo grown men doing BDSM in the woods that we all know and love. Lastly, we have an archetype that definitely is not writer exclusive, but it sure shows up here. High-int, questionable morals. In this category, we have Kitaoka from Ryuki, Ryoma from Gaim, Kuroto from Xaid, Guy from 01, George from Revice, and Nyelv and Suga from Galv. Now, not all of these characters are villains, but they're often at least a little antagonistic, and they sure have the brains to get shit done, even if what they're getting done is not great for the characters that we're rooting for. Kitaoka, for example, is not a villain. He's a misogynist who needs to burn for his crimes against women, yes, but he's not exactly a villain. Ryuki's whole point is that people's wishes, no matter how selfish, are consistent with justice in the hearts and minds of the people making said wishes. So while Kitaoka's wish to live forever is a selfish one, and while he does fuck with people a lot, it's also a wish that he has every right to have. George isn't really antagonistic either, save for at the very end of Revice where he's gone all Juga because he's mourning the fact that he'll never get closure with his father. For the rest of the show, every single action George makes is due to the fact that his moral alignment is Kamen Rider, and he's trying to make things as Kamen Rider as possible. Giving Hiromi the demon's driver, even knowing it'd slowly turn the dude elderly, and engineering the situation with Daiji and Kagero to make live/Evil happen, might not be morally good by our standards, but it did make for some great Kamen Riders, so George succeeded. Ryoma, Kuroto, Guy, Nyelv, and Suga, on the other hand, are all definitely antagonistic. Ryoma is smart, yes. Takatora straight up states that Ryoma's intellect is necessary to save the world, but he also betrays Takatora and runs away like a coward when Zelene gets too chaotic. Kuroto... Look, if you've seen Xaid, I don't have to explain Kuroto to you. If you haven't seen Xaid, let's put it this way. There are better reactions to a kid having better video game ideas than you than sending him a bespoke virus to fuck him up specifically. Trousers is capitalism personified, and while his insistence that humans can do more than AI can has aged really weirdly in the year since 01 aired, he also made my dog cry, so he's firmly in the category of villain I absolutely fucking hate forever. And Nyelv and Suga... Well, Suga kind of had backstory motivations for his villainy, and Nyelv at least tried to defect to Shoma's side for a little bit, but both of them died villains. What I think these characters teach is that yes, you can be smart, but if you don't use your brain for kindness, you're gonna end up punched into walls, trapped in a buckle driver, forced to have homoerotic tension with Don Kuroto, or otherwise just killed. Having a good brain doesn't prevent you from having trauma, or things you otherwise need to work through either. With George, for example, his complicated feelings towards his father don't just go away just because he's also smart enough to make all these belts. Intelligence shouldn't be something that prevents you from feeling empathy towards others, or kindness towards yourself, and by having these characters be the way that they are, kids learn that.
In conclusion,
as per usual, I come into this conclusion section with a hypothetical question you may have. Why, Laura, did you decide to make this video? Well, to put it simply, I think media literacy is a good thing to have. I think that being able to figure out what a story is trying to tell you is important not just for stuff like Kamen Rider, but for any work with a story at all. Every single person who creates a story is doing it for a reason. There is always something that can be gained from art, even if said art is dudes in suits and fancy belts kicking monsters until they blow up. And if you can tell what a piece of art is trying to say, even if you don't like said piece of art, you may at least understand why other people do. Now, I'm lucky. I have a really awesome dad who I go to the movies with every week. As a result, I get exposed to all kinds of stories, and that in turn has allowed me to understand how a lot of stories work. But I also know that, for a lot of people, it's not as easy as just watching something that isn't Kamen Rider. I chose to look into Kamen Rider's archetypes specifically so that people can still understand why and how a story is told, and so that they can get more out of the stories they're engaging with, without actually having to step out of their comfort zone. Like I said earlier, I know a lot of people watch Rider, and tokusatsu in general, as escapism, and I can't really blame anyone for not wanting to look deeper into the gears that make the story go forward. You don't really need to know what a trope is or how a character works to enjoy something, and I'm not going to pretend that I'm immune to hype moments and aura either. I also don't want this video to be any kind of be-all, end-all categorization system, because I have not seen every single Kamen Rider episode ever, and I know there's a lot of different kinds of characters that I didn't mention. That said, I know that for me, really digging deep into a story's framework and the way it writes its characters is part of what makes tokusatsu so much fun to watch. And if you guys can understand how I watch tokusatsu and what I get from it, maybe my other spicy takes will be a little bit easier to swallow. So however you watch Writer, whatever it is you get from it, I hope I've helped you understand a little bit of why the stories we all love work the way they do. And if you can think of any other archetypes, or where characters from seasons of Writer that I haven't seen may go, please leave a comment. I'd love to see all y'all's brains working in the same way that mine does. And in the meantime, whether you find yourself drawn to every dude heroes, their adjacent grumps, or the magical pretty boys who may or may not make it out of the shows they're from alive, we're all out here loving the same shows and characters. We can all learn a little bit from Kamen Rider, and maybe it's cheesy, but I think that's kind of beautiful. And now that we have made it to the end of the video, thank you very much for watching first and foremost. In the description below, you can find a link to my Linktree that has everywhere you can find me online, including my shirt store. So if you like this Zio shirt, you can cop your own. And it also has my Buy Me a Coffee, so for whatever reason you want to give me $5, then you can totally do so. I will actually be taking a break next month, simply because any work you do, you're going to need to take a break at some point. So while I will only be doing Catching Some Zets, I will be probably back in April with another cover, and hopefully sometime in spring I will have another video essay up. All I have to say is that my videos, even my longer ones, might be a little bit shorter in the coming, months, but that's just because I am putting all of my effort into this video that's going to come out much later this year, so I hope you are looking forward to that as much as I'm looking forward to it, which is a lot. So yeah, that is all for me this time. Thank you so much for watching. Bye-bye! To my Linktree that has everywhere you can find me online, so find me, bitch. Sweet great blooper footage of me untangling this knot that I found in my mic. Because this video is going to be covering archetypes that I've noticed Frankai's my Poppy scroll is like right there, and I'm looking to her for strength. Because what the fuck? Tertiary writers based precisely on talking is hard. Now, I wanna go home. So had it rough and came out the other side. That was ass. Or the girlfriend they're definitely in love with. And as a result, they're Laura bait. As a result, they're Laura bait. How to Train Your Dragon is a fucking excellent movie trilogy. And I know you all know what I'm talking about.